Hello, beautiful people. Apologies for the delay. We are going to be talking about some interesting things this evening. I'm sorry to keep you waiting a couple of minutes, but it took me that much time to get my act together. At any rate, here I am, and thank you for joining me. Please follow Semigog as well as A Safer Space. You can do that on BitChute. You can do that on YouTube. There is Minds, there is Gab, there is Twitter, and there is Telegram. For those who wish to support the channel, there is GoFundMe and there is Subscribestar. Before we move on, allow me to celebrate the Praetorian Chads responsible for supporting this channel thus far. These are the immortals who have helped in any number of ways. Thank you very, very much for supporting the channel. As it says at the top there, all of the credit and none of the blame. All right, now can people just jump in and let me know that the audio and the video are good, and then we will get started. While people are coming in and I wait for the text to roll through, I'm going to pour myself a tasty beverage, a bit of apple juice to help me get through the evening. And yeah, we'll get started. This, my friends, will be interesting. Okay, Baggins, New Zealand says audio is good. Okay, several folks coming in. Thank you. I do appreciate it. Now, for this clip, this is really for the people who come in now, more or less. If you come in if someone comes in the middle later, I can't address them now, given that they're not at present here. Please help them out in the chat if they come in and they're like, oh, what's going on? What's he talking about? Just let them know that it's probably best if they wait until it finish and then come back and watch it from the beginning later, because we're going to cover a lot of ground here. Yes, indeed. So what ground are we going to cover? Well, a number of things. First off, obviously my last live stream, if you don't see it here at YouTube, that's because it is now an exclusive on the alternate platform, because I did not wish to risk my channel by leaving it up. However, I still publicly acknowledge my eating of crow and being incorrect about Trump. If anyone wants to go and relive that moment, I certainly don't. You can head over to the alternate video platform and do so. So that is a kind of background, as I have, had to turn around and turn inward and reassess everything that I was looking at out there and drawing my conclusions from. And this is a right and proper process. One should definitely undertake it when one has been wrong. When one has been inaccurate with predictions. There are the issues of where you went wrong, how, and when. And that got me to thinking about reviewing what I know of how I predict, how I think, how I interpret, how in fact I understand or come to understandings and make predictions and the rest. And that caused me to undertake remembering any number of things that I know or think I know about it. At the same time, over on Twitter, where I am still active, though hopefully that will soon be changing. Other than the occasional dropping in order to post things, or if there's some sudden news, I need to tear myself away from that horror show. But not yet. But not yet, not quite yet. Over there on Twitter, there's been discussion of IQ, and a number of interesting things have come up, for me anyway, related to that subject. And that's something that I want to touch on here. High IQ, as it's referred to, which I see essentially as a kind of sensitivity. I find it most useful to gloss all of that as sensitivity for reasons that I hope will become clear in this rambling discussion. I think we're going to also talk about how connections are made in the context of drug-related psychosis. It has been glossed by my friend Tim as the white spider, an aspect of the mind that seeks to connect phenomena with the filaments of its considerations in ways that may look insane to other people, but that yield some kind of understanding as the psyche is trying to assemble the various elements that confront it. It's also been called, or I call it, the black sun. Not the black sun that, for example, folkish societies of mid-century Germans have an interest in, related to the dark reaches of Thule. This is something else that has definitely a sort of its own deep esoteric roots, as it were, but not related to all that fuss from the middle of the 20th century. We're also going to be looking at Rumi's discussion of Chinese and Greek artists. Yeah, and we're going to take a little walk through A Rebours by Huysmans, and this character Des Esseintes, however the hell you say that. Really what we're going to be dealing with here is a kind of flora legium. Hopefully I'm going to be able to show you some things through how I talk about this, no less than in what I talk about, if I'm successful in this. So the first thing is this idea of remembering, of assembling elements. And, you know, this is something that happens in any case of interpretation, but the method I'm going to use to try to share with you my understanding of this process, because remember, we're kind of stepping away from me getting things wrong. Don't expect any more about really thinking about Trump directly in what will follow. This is more of thinking that was spurred on my part by having to confront the fact that my predictions were wrong. And so, again, I had to revisit how it is I understand the whole process occurring, because not only do you have to understand where you went wrong and how and when and those sorts of things, you also have to understand how the system works, how the system of assembling information and attempting to extract meaning from the way in which you've constellated it. You have to think about that as well. And so that's really what we're going to talk about here, the idea of interpretation, you know, a hermeneutic grill, or you know, a thing that I've often talked about in the past, which is the idea of ta'wil, which is sort of heterodox, esoteric Muslim exegesis of scripture. So there are many ways of looking at this. It ranges, as I said, from, you know, esoteric interpretations of scripture and heterodox Shiite groups, all the way over to the white spider, as it were, of drug psychosis that attempts to relate things. Any number of angles on this. We'll even get over into some of what's called mysticism or hermeticism as well. And the technique that I'm going to use in this remembering is really what amounts to me talking through a flora legium. What is a flora legium, you ask? I can hear you all asking, clamoring crowds of people saying, what is a flora legium? And there are probably some, you know, trad cats in the background going, I know what a flora legium is. Well, I'm going to give you a quick introduction. This is from Mary Carruthers' book, The Book of Memory, a study of memory in medieval culture. It is an excellent book, an excellent book. Now, hopefully I can just hit this briefly because there's going to be a fair amount of reading here. I'm going to try and keep it from being boring. And hopefully, given that this is an adult subject for thinking adults, hopefully you guys can keep up with me as I go through these different elements. And this by way of introduction of what we're about to get involved in, remembering, myself going through what I know in order to share it with you. And hopefully in the way I choose to do it, I will show some things that are of use to people, no less than in what it is actually that I'm talking about. So from at least Alexandrine times, a favored form of elementary textbook was the Flora Legium, or compilation of extracts and maxims derived from the great writers of the past. It was as popular with Christians as it had been with pagans. I've alluded to this literary form many times during my study, but I now want to look at the genre in greater detail. Its essence is well defined by the title of Petrarch's contribution to it, Rerum Memorandarum Libri, A florilegium is basically the contents of someone's memory set forth as a kind of study guide for the formation of others' memories. So I will not go so far as to say that what I'm about to cover here qualifies in any sense truly as a florilegium, and I'm certainly not one of the great thinkers of the past, but I'm going to tap on things from my own experience in these books in order to try to paint this picture. So I want to start with the idea of consensus, and consensus as a way of approaching something and making determinations about what's going on. That should be very much on everyone's minds, because there are some people who decided screw consensus. I'll let you guess who that might be. There are certainly others besides myself. There are those who push back against consensus and refuse to be bound by it in making their determinations, even sometimes to their folly. And then there are those who do operate with consensus. So we have sort of two ideas. The idea that, groups of people, it's like the idea of voting. Somehow as everyone gets together, you're going to sort of meet in the middle somehow, and you'll have something that's mostly not wrong or that's mostly right. The reality of this we'll leave aside. Let's just say we're looking at it charitably. The idea of what sort of conclusions one reaches when you approach it with consensus. Then there is this other idea of people who push against the grain. À rebours. I can't fucking pronounce French. We'll get to that with Huysmans in just a second. Against the grain, against nature. There are those who step outside of the line and say to hell with consensus. They are considered eccentrics because their orbits, so to speak, are eccentric, and they try to tackle things on their own. Now, there are all sorts of issues that can come with that. I would recommend, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that Dutton has any number of clips, I believe, where he looks into issues related to genius or high IQ and these sorts of things, and the kind of problems that can come along with it. On the one hand, as I said, you have the idea of people who push outwards on their own to come to different determinations in their own eccentric ways. And then there are people who sort of reach their conclusions by consensus. On the one hand, you have sort of the Jungian idea of a collective unconscious, that there is a wisdom in the group. I'm not drawing a direct parallel, but you understand that these things are related, that a group of people somehow, if they reach deep down within themselves far enough, they will find a compendium of the knowledge that they all share. And then there is this idea on the other side, again, not a direct correspondence to people going off and doing their own thing, but that it underpins what I'm talking about. And that is an idea of a individual superconscious. Conscious. So over on the one side, it's unconscious, and it's something held by the collective, and we all share it and participate in it. And sort of everything of man's knowledge is conceived of, as being able to be found in that place, perhaps in dreams, perhaps reflected as through a glass darkly, but you understand me. Human heritage is all deep there, and one can find it, whether you want to call it the collective unconscious, whether you want to go off into la la land with the Akashic records, makes no mind to me. On the other side, you sort of have the idea of an individual superconscious consciousness, and or superconscious. And this is likewise, in my view, a place where all that is can be found, at least to whatever extent it can be found in the collective unconscious. But in this case, it's not necessary to look into what is our shared heritage, or rather, in this case, it can be captured in a single reflection carried by one person. I don't want to get too far into this because it's speculative, but what I'm trying to underscore is sort of two ways of looking at everything. And to some people, probably the idea of an individual superconscious that contains sort of all of man's inheritance in it, but that is uniquely one's own rather than shared, though of course it is shared. Perhaps there will be people who will come up hard against that, but it's a theme that's underneath that I want to underscore for those who can sort of read between the lines and make the most of what I'm saying. It's not truly central to everything, but I don't know. It is. Let me leave it at that. So As I said, we're talking about IQ and being intelligent because of recent events. Obviously, I'm looking at my own thoughts. I like to think of myself as intelligent, and yet I'm in error. And I mentioned this business of sensitivity and the idea that high intelligence comes with a cost. I mentioned this business of heading over to Dutton's channel to look at ways in which genius can cause you problems. You can also see the way in which, from an evolutionary perspective, just to gloss some of the basic ideas, there's certain patterns. They work over time. They get encoded into human behavior. They can be glossed as instinct, right? And generally, they're a pretty safe guide, or they would not have been selected for, and they would not manifest in human behavior time and again. Things like, for example, suspicion regarding outsiders. Let's leave aside our recent couple of centuries of social engineering and utopian projects. The idea is that there's a way that has been sort of beaten into us, into our genetics by nature and circumstance. It has been selected for, and it's pretty much the safest way. So if someone comes at trying to figure out what's going on and they form an opinion based on consensus, they're at least going to do as well as the herd that feels a ripple of fear wash over it at the sight of cheetahs looking to pick off stragglers, right? There's a function there, and it has value. Unfortunately, it can also fly off the handle when you have things like mob reactions that are caused by misunderstandings and end up with people trampled on the ground and dead. So there are risks to stepping outside of that framework. I just mentioned some of the risks associated with being in this sort of herd consensus framework. Likewise, there are risks stepping outside of it and having one's personality get a bit attenuated, becoming perhaps in certain ways hypersensitive to information and potential relationships, so much so that it becomes not only possible, but even likely in certain cases to get a misreading of events, of circumstances, of conditions. Perhaps that is some of what I was dealing with the business about Trump. But sensitivity is something that I really want to underscore. It does come with costs. So, for example, you have truly autistic children. Very often you find out that they're not your Rain Man. Especially gifted in one way or another. Very often they have issues with sensitivity and with emotional expression, so far as I understand it. Haven't raised an autistic child, don't know a great deal about it, but that is my understanding. And for example, certain sense impressions can be overwhelming for them and create moments of crisis for them. So we can see sort of what we joke about as autists as people who are sharply focused on details of, reasoning processes and review of evidence and this sort of thing. They get called autists, and perhaps there's some truth to that insofar as there's a high degree of sensitivity to particular details and ways of understanding. So much so that it can exclude, sensitivity, for example, to social circumstances and norms and, rituals of behavior, polite society, minding your manners, not alienating or alarming people, calming people. So we can see that there can be sort of an emotional price to it. And we can see the sensitivity underscored with the autist, but you've also got the idea of more functional people who are, in this case, certainly of high intelligence, and who themselves are highly, highly sensitive to sense impressions. For example, with me, scent, very sensitive to it, even though I smoke, which you would think kind of interferes with that sense modality. Nevertheless, very, very sensitive as regards scent and very sensitive as regards color. You read about women who, for example, are more likely than men to see differences in color that puts them in a minority relative to the rest of the population. Whatever that is, I have it. Hearing, particularly the color of light and the amount of light. It irritates me no end using the light that I do to illuminate my face as I speak to you now. Happily, my vanity, on the other hand, is such that I'll go ahead and use a ring light. But that by way of covering some of the ways in which there's sensitivity. I can be extremely sensitive to people's tone of voice, all sorts of things. Now, it doesn't make me dysfunctional unless, for example, you take it as far as, making predictions about the future and being wrong about them. There is a price to this sensitivity. There is a price to moving away from the collective and trying to do things independently in innovative ways that might end up not being, let's say, a broad highway into the evolutionary future, but rather a dead end in more senses than one. So this by way of background. Let's jump over to this character of an attenuated aesthete that we find in Huysmans' book À rebours. And he's this character, des Esseintes, and, well, if anybody's read it, you'll know. I'm just going to touch a piece of this. He's someone who gets lost in sense experiences, in aesthetic dimensions of experience. And there's just a little section I wanted to cover. Well, it's not that little. Hopefully you'll bear with me. Where this crazy guy has headed out into the world and decided, because he's very wealthy, that he's going to create and decorate a house for himself. Now here is an eccentric, the kind of eccentric that you would expect to hear about in 18th or 19th century England or France or something. Someone who draws themselves apart, particularly, this sort of romantic archetype of the attenuated aesthete. And I'm going to use this to illustrate hypersensitivity and its vagaries, particularly as regards color. And then we're going to move on to some of these other aspects. Like I said, we've got some hermeticism, a little bit of Giordano Bruno. We've got a little bit of Rumi, and hopefully by assembling these little pieces of our in our process of creating a flora legium, or expressing one, of remembering some ideas, a whole greater than the sum of its parts will become visible to you. So, as I said, des Esseintes is trying to set up his. God, am I saying that right? I can't remember anything in French. Des Esseintes. Yes, he's setting up his own home. And so the author goes, what he wanted was colors which would appear stronger and clearer in artificial light. He did not particularly care if they looked crude or insipid in daylight, for he lived most of his life at night, holding that night afforded greater intimacy and isolation, and that the mind was truly roused and stimulated only by awareness of the dark. Moreover, he derived a peculiar pleasure from being in a well-lighted room when all the surrounding houses were wrapped in sleep and darkness, a sort of enjoyment in which vanity may have played some small part, a very special feeling of satisfaction familiar to those who sometimes work late at night and draw aside the curtains to find that all around them the world is dark, silent, and dead. This somehow calls out to me. Slowly, one by one, he went through the various colors. Blue, he remembered, takes on an artificial green tint by candlelight. If a dark blue indigo like indigo or cobalt, it becomes black. If pale, it turns gray. And if soft and true like turquoise, it goes dull and cold. There could, therefore, be no question of making it the keynote of a room, though it might be used to help out another color. On the other hand, under the same conditions, the iron grays grow sullen and heavy. The pearl grays lose their blue sheen and are metamorphosed into a dirty white. The browns become cold and sleepy. And as for the dark greens, such as emperor green and myrtle green, they react like the dark blues and turn quite black. Only the pale greens remained, peacock green, for instance, or the cinnabar, and lacquer greens. But then artificial light kills the blue in them and leaves only the yellow, which for its part lacks clarity and consistency. Nor was there any point in thinking of such delicate tints as salmon pink, maize, and rose, for their very effeminacy would run counter to his ideas of complete isolation. Nor again was it any use considering the various shades of purple, which with one exception lose their luster in candlelight. That exception is plum, which somehow survives intact. But then what a muddy reddish hue it is, unpleasantly like lees of wine. Besides, it struck him as utterly futile to resort to this range of tints, insofar as it is possible to see purple by ingesting a specified amount of santonin, and thus it becomes a simple matter for anyone to change the color of his walls without laying a finger on them. Having rejected all these colors, he was left with only three: red, orange, and yellow. Of the three, he preferred orange. So, confirming by his own example the truth of a theory to which he attributed almost mathematical validity, to wit, that there exists a close correspondence between the sensual makeup of a person with a truly artistic temperament and whatever color that person reacts to most strongly and sympathetically. In fact, leaving out of account the majority of men whose coarse retinas perceive neither the cadences peculiar to different colors nor the mysterious charm of their gradation, leaving out also those bourgeois optics that are insensible to the pomp and glory of the clear, bright colors, and considering only those people with delicate eyes that have undergone the education of libraries and art galleries, it seemed to him an undeniable fact that anyone who dreams of the ideal prefers illusion to reality, and calls for veils to clothe the naked truth, is almost certain to appreciate the soothing caress of blue and its cognates, such as mauve, lilac, and pearl gray, always provided they retain their delicacy and do not pass the point where they change their personalities and turn into pure violets and stark grays. The hardy, blustering type, on the other hand, the handsome, full-blooded sort, the strapping he-men who scorn the formalities of life and rush straight for their goal, losing their heads completely, these generally delight in the vivid glare of the reds and yellows, in the percussion effect of the vermilions and chromes, which bind their eyes and intoxicate their senses. As for those gaunt, febrile creatures of feeble constitution and nervous disposition, whose sensual appetite craves dishes that are smoked and seasoned, their eyes almost always prefer that most morbid and irritating of colors, with its acid glow and unnatural splendor: orange. There could therefore be no doubt whatever as to Des Esseintes' final choice, but indubitable difficulties still remain to be solved. If red and yellow become more pronounced in artificial light, the same is not true of their compound orange, which often flares up into a fiery nasturtium red. He carefully studied all its different shades by candlelight and finally discovered one which he considered likely to keep its balance and answer his requirements. Once these preliminaries were over, he made every effort to avoid, in his study at any rate, the use of oriental rugs and fabrics, which had become so commonplace and vulgar now that upstart tradesmen could buy them in the bargain basement of any department store. Oh, well. Aristocratic indulgence brought down to date. I confess, I didn't buy my textiles in a department store. So we have this idea of a crazy, and we can see how this crazy, this hypersensitive, attenuated aesthete is paying so much attention to all these details, and they're things that no one else really sees. Most people don't see such things. Now, you can be taught to see such things. A woman, for example, who wishes to balance her complexion with cosmetics is going to learn to look and see colors in a different way. Or at least once upon a time, they were more subtle about it. Now they've got this business of painting, doing this weird white underpainting beneath their multiple caked upon layers of makeup. And they attempt to, I guess, through light and darkness, much like exercises that artists do where you draw the sphere and you try and work on shading and the rest in order to create mass in 2 dimensions. They attempt to darken and lighten certain areas of the face so as to change the features that they wish to regarding, how the mass of their skull works with the light. Because I notice such things, I find it horrifying because I see it. It's like that. And I don't wear makeup and I haven't studied it, but as soon as I look, because I'm so sensitive to skin color and shades and all the rest, you see it. It's much like with Des Esseintes. But we have a crazy here. I mean, we have a crazy here. We have a crazy that is under discussion with us right now. There are lots of these crazies. I mean, think, for example, of the Q people that are currently being mocked. Think, for example, of Thomas Victor or whatever, who has made all sorts of predictions in the past that were accurate, and is now facing the apparent failure of his prediction as regards Trump. And he's got new ideas for how it could work. Now, to many people, that seems pathetic. It's crazy. They're out there on the edge. I mean, a lot of people came to me and they're like, why did you stick with this prediction about what's going on with Trump for so long? Well, because I don't give a shit about consensus, except in certain specific circumstances. Like when I have a recourse to it and I want to hear it, then I'll go ask. I've never been someone to do polls. Could not care less, ever, because I don't feel that human beings taken as a whole are going to give me anything like the quality of insight and understanding that I can achieve entirely on my own. And that is part of what motivates people like Thomas Victor, who is always talking about the fact that he's been walking a line, barely staying this side of sanity, and has apparently had mental issues in the past. I'm not trying to cast aspersions about him. I don't know. I've just seen him mention this at times. He also kind of plays that role by, for example, putting a sieve on his head or some kind of weird pot that he wears in his photographs, you know, and he talks about how he's allowed to discuss what he does only because people dismiss him as crazy. You know, there are certain themes. On the one hand, you have a des Esseintes, who is almost morbidly occupied with, you know, different shades of color, which illustrates how a kind of sensitivity, which, remember, I've equated with high intelligence. I mean, for practical purposes, they're one and the same as far as I'm concerned. Increased sensitivity, whether it's to spatial relationships, whether it's to grouping, you know, the way the ancient Greeks dealt with arithmetic by laying out pebbles, you know, even and odd, or the tetractys with Pythagoras, you know, whatever it is that you're more sensitive to. Whether it's to speech and grammatical relationships and what's correct or not, whether it's to pitch and your genius carries you into music. Really, to me, it all comes down to sensitivity, whether it's in a narrow band or a wide one. But as we've underscored, or as I've tried to underscore, that sensitivity comes with a cost, and it can carry you over into the land of des Esseintes on the one hand, or over into the realm of a Thomas Victor on the other, or an alien guy, you know, like people talking about Simon Parks. He's a kook. He's surrounded by kooks. And I hope that these things that I'm talking about will carry over to some of the thinking, perhaps, that AA is going to put into what he says will be an upcoming discussion of kooks. Because I think it's very easy to quickly dismiss such people. I'm not saying that AA has. He's actually been quite fair with them. But in general, it's very easy to dismiss the kooks because you've seen that the kooks don't care about you. And after all, they're fucking kooks. So, you know, they're attempting to stitch things together. It's why we see the crap on the board where, for some reason, everybody seems to think that if you're crazy, what you're supposed to do is pin large numbers of things to the wall and attach them with strings. And that's always the sign of a crazy person. Or writing a large amount in books. You know, I think maybe it was the Mel Gibson movie, A Conspiracy Theory, where he had all kinds of, you know, cut out stuff on the wall, and he's considered obsessive. And you see in television and movies that that's very much the archetype for someone who's crazy. They're attempting to put pins in the map, and they've got all this stuff thrown up on the wall. And for some reason, somebody at some point decided that all those fucking collages on the wall should have red yarn. So now they all have fucking red yarn sticking to them. And I'm a person who uses such approaches all the time. And I don't even know what the fuck I'm looking at. It's like someone shat on the floor and said, "Behold my Rembrandt." It's fucking ridiculous. But that's the way that they show obsession. Right? If you got some character in a movie who's after the women, they'll show him as, you know, being obsessive. He'll be, you know, have pictures up on the wall, and he'll be, you know, collecting things like he's crazy. It's always a sign of someone being crazy, something not being quite right. They're trying to see patterns that aren't there, right? But at the same time, genius will be expressed in such ways too. So they'll have the smart kid who was like, well, we got to figure it out. And so we got together and sat around the table and we put the stuff up on the board, or the FBI guy, or the manhunter who's supposed to get in the mind of the serial killer, and they put the photographs on the wall. So it is acceptable. It is understood. It's multivalent. On the one side, it's a sign of going off the deep end and being crazy. On the other side, it's recognized that that is a way that people who are good at such things, I mean, insofar as they can represent it in a half-assed way with their ignorance and their stupidity, but they're at least trying to show that, you know, it could go either way. They could be crazy and obsessive, you know, but the people who study the crazy obsessive ones and use the same techniques, they have to be careful not to gaze too long into the abyss, or the abyss will gaze back into them, right? That's how it's characterized. Again, we see the idea of it being crazy and it being a two-edged sword. Now, at the outset, I said that this was going to be about a kind of approach in terms of metaphysics. And by that, I don't mean changing. I mean beyond, above, you know, metaphysics in quotes. That's a way that we're going to be looking at this, because I certainly wouldn't, I'm not so absurd as to call myself a mystic. But for me personally, for those who don't know, mysticism and things that can be construed as mystic are my primary interests in life. I'm not going to say I'm spiritual, not religious, but I do believe in God. And to me, things, the mystics themselves, or things that are mystic, are most interesting to me because it speaks of a direct personal knowledge or direct personal experience, even though technically what we're talking about as knowledge or experience transcends and exceeds it. I'm putting a sharp red underline under that, so don't come at me later about that. These things interest me, so I want to take a look at this topic from a metaphysical point of view, if you will. So I'm going to take a couple of examples, or several actually, and this is where we get into our flora legium. We've jumped from wisma, and now we are going to take a look at some other things. What do I wish to go to next? Do I wish to go to the black sun? Do I wish to go to the sun and moon in the mirror? Let's start with the sun and moon in the mirror. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to open up on my screen here Etymology, one of my favorite websites, which allows me to look into etymology. And first, let's look at moon. Moon, heavenly body which revolves around the earth monthly. Middle English mona, from Old English mona, from Proto-Germanic menon. Source also of Old Saxon and Old High German mano, Old Frisian mona, Old Norse mani, Danish man, Dutch man, German mond, Gothic mena, moon, from Proto-Indo-European menses, moon and month. I guess that has to do with a woman's monthly courses. Source also of Sanskrit masa, moon or month, Avestan ma, Persian mah, Armenian mis for month, Greek mene for moon, excuse me, men, month, Latin mensis, month, Old Church Slavonic mesici. That's like that song I like, that Yugoslavian song, Mesečina. Mesečina, Mesečina, yo. Okay, I'm not going there. Lithuanian menesis, moon month, Old Irish me, Welsh mis, Breton mise, from root me, to measure. Proto-Indo-European root me, to measure, in reference to the moon's phases. Excuse me. In reference to the moon's phases, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, as an ancient and universal measure of time. So let's go look at that root me. What other words come out of it? Centimeter, commensurate, diameter, dimension, gematria, geometry, immense, isometric, measure, menarche, menopause, menses, menstrual, menstruate, mensural, meter, in many senses, metis, which is cunning, metric, metrical, metronome, metry, Monday, month, moon, parameter, pentameter, perimeter, piecemeal, semester, symmetry, thermometer, trigonometry, trimester. Weird. A lot of those things have to do with measuring, obviously, because it's this root about measuring. And we've got this idea of cycles of time and the moon. Now, the moon reflects the sun. Before we get into that, let me go back to one other thing we have to take a look at here, which is mental. Looked at moon, let's look at mental. Mental, in, of, or pertaining to the mind, characteristic of the intellect, from late Latin mentalis, of the mind, from Latin mens, genitive mentis, mind, from Proto-Indo-European root men, to think. You know what's weird? There's a Persian god of the moon called Men, and you know, Proto-Indo-European root men is pretty damn close to the Proto-Indo-European root me, and we do see some interesting overlap between the idea of me, which is to measure, and men, which is to think. In order to take a look at that, we've got to go over to ratio and reason to illustrate the same kind of adjacency or the semantic overlap of these words, or groups, constellations of words. So for ratio, we have reason, rationale, from Latin ratio, reckoning, numbering, calculation. Also reason, reasoning, judgment, and understanding, from rat, past participle stem of reri, to reckon or calculate. Also think, from Proto-Indo-European root re, to reason or count. So we have reasoning and counting. We know that me in Proto-Indo-European is about measuring, like the measuring of the months, this primal way of measuring time, once upon a time. And we have the idea of men, which gives us mental and mind. And in those two things, which I argue are very likely related because of semantic overlap, if you will, we see the same thing reflected with ratio, which is about measuring and reasoning, or counting and reasoning, seeing proportions, spatial understandings, and the rest. So to measure and to engage in thought processes have considerable amounts of overlap, and we see that in metaphor they do too. Thank you very much for bearing with me, ladies and gentlemen. I told you I would try to make this interesting. We had to go through that because now we're going to jump over to the subject of the moon. And the moon is closely associated in esoteric lore with the mind and with the idea of reflection. Reflection itself being a term that we typically use to describe the process of speculation and thought. Consideration, that's another one. Considere, which means to consult the stars. Speculation being a Latin version, literally, of to reflect. And what do we have with these two planets that are considered to be the closest to us? And I say planets in the classical sense, Ptolemaic system. I realize the sun is a star. I don't care. So typically the way it is described is that you have the sun, which sheds its masculine outward force and light, and it is captured and reflected by the moon. And that the moon participates in the sun's force and energy in reality insofar as it reflects it. Now, people are going to have to be fairly subtle and fairly able to follow a thread of discussion in speech and spin it and follow it and keep it like a sutra, like a suture, like a thread, which is why this is a teaching gesture. You're going to have to follow these pieces that I'm trying to twist together. We have the idea of mental sensitivity and minds that are maybe too dilated to sense impressions, even to the point of madness, right? We have the idea of, which we covered that with Des Esseintes. We talked about it a little bit with Thomas Victor. Here's another one actually that I need to pull up. This is one I need to read to you. This is one a friend sent to me that is interesting indeed. I was doing some correspondence with a friend back in 2007, and we were talking about a number of esoteric points. And he sent me this, which is from one M. Lorenz, 1961. There wasn't a citation for the book, but if anybody wanted to find it, it's Lorenz with the Z, 1961. And it's said to be remarks of an anonymous schizophrenic. This person writes, chirps in a box. If you abstract yourself far enough from a given context, you seem somehow to create a new kind of concretion. It isn't something you hear or see, but yet somehow. It's being fascinated with the generative process of the mind. The thing is to be caught in it, yet abstract from it, both be in it and out of it, revolving, everything around me. You explode like when stars explode. In the sky, a plate which burned bright. Let me read that again. In the sky, a plate which burned bright. Lunatic, anyone? Symbol of all light and energy with me contracted into this plate. You know, there's a thing from I think the Thousand Nights and a Night where they refer frequently to a woman of beauty as having a face like a silver dish, like the moon. A plate which burned bright. Weird. Spanish plata. It means silver, doesn't it? Wow. And isn't the metal of the sun gold and of the moon silver? Do we see any intertwined themes here? I certainly do. Those of you who are following along, hopefully some few of you will see them too. So we have this idea of reflection, but reflection that can become, what is that term? Specifically a medical term. Something very bad medically. Pathological. That's what I was looking for. A type of reflection that can become pathological. But let's come back to this idea of the sun and moon. Typically, the light that is, we see it shining forth from the sun, and it heats all things and it gives them life. But the moon is like a cold and sterile mirror. And yet at night, the moon is what gives us light. And also animals are extremely sensitive to the moon. Fish as well, as fishermen and hunters know. There's a kind of a burgeoning of life at night at times when the moon most reflects the light of the sun. And yet all the moon does is reflect. But let's come back around. What was that? That was me, to measure. That also gives us menses and month. But it seems just adjacent and doubtless overlapping in certain respects with mind and mental. And we know that when people go mental, we call them lunatics. But what is this thing? It's this burning silver plate in the sky that this schizophrenic talks about. The plate which burned bright. These people who are barking mad. Wonder why they say barking mad. Does it have anything to do with animals barking at the moon, as it were? I don't know. It reflects. It reflects. And again, we've talked about the metaphor, speculation, reflection for our own thinking processes. Hopefully you guys are front loading this, because what we're doing is we're indulging in this and reviewing through a kind of flora legium this process. And I'm going to jump over to another one. Or should I do it second? I'm going to put the harder stuff first. So the things that make more sense will come at the end. So even if everybody didn't follow all of it, they'll at least get a reward at the end and feel like they got some of it. Okay, this is a translation, like all the translations of Bruno's magical works, except for one produced by Cambridge. It's a crappy translation from Latin. Giordano Bruno, on the composition of images, signs, and ideas. Again, crappy translation, but we're going to go through a few things. Again, all this should link together. People who are listening and who are confused, who can't follow this, I'm sorry, I can't make it any easier. You're going to have to take these pieces and consider them yourselves, and make of them what you will. And for many, it will not be enough. And for those that can understand, it's probably already too much. So Bruno writes, again, in a crappy translation. This is the dedicatory epistle of this book, which was written by Bruno in 1591, or published, I should say. And this dedicatory epistle is to Sir Johann Heinrich Heinzel, Lord of the Castle Elg, from Giordano Bruno the Nolan, signed. I'm not going to give you all of it, but and his writing style is insane because he's constantly using descriptive triads. I mean, and it's over the fucking top. But anyway, he was an Italian. He was from southern Italy, more or less, Nola. So I give to you one child from among the principal children of my genius, conceived and formed a long time ago. Its main theme is the composition of images, signs, and ideas for the purpose of mastering universal invention, arrangement, and memory. If it turns out here that I also attain, comprehend, and grasp what I am proposing, examining, and discussing, such that the trouble is easy where it may not be easy enough, short where it cannot be brief enough, sufficient in a matter where something like this could hardly be, or at least be believed, satisfactory and worthy enough, I shall seem to have realized something quite uncommon. The idea, the imagination, the shape, the designation, the notation is the universe of God, the work of nature and reason, and is controlled by analogy with them, so that nature may admirably reflect divine action, and then innate human ability rival, as if reaching toward even higher things, nature's operation. Who does not see with how few elements nature constantly makes so many things? Indeed, there is no one who does not know that this happens, because nature places, orders, composes, moves, and guides these same four elements, and under signs varied according to the thing formed and figured, she derives them from possibility's abyss to the summit of act. But by a mortal God, what can be easier for people than counting? First, since there is one, there are two, three, four. Second, because one is not two is not three is not four. Third, because one and two are three, because one and three are four. To do this is to do everything. To say this is to say all. To imagine, signify, and shape this makes all things objects to apprehend. To understand once apprehended, remembered when understood. The full light of this is more present, clear, and arrayed for our intelligence than sunlight, which can be marshaled for our outer eyes. For it rises and sets, and as often as we turn ourselves towards it, it is not there. Here he speaks of the sun. But that other magical light is no less present to us than to itself for us. So present in the mind, it is even in mind itself. Mind, mens, mental, moon. Nevertheless, do you wish me to tell why so few know and comprehend this? Why, I say, do we consider what is continually present for us in so much of the sky to be remote? Because the eye sees other things. It does not see itself. Yet what is the nature of the eye that sees other things, that so sees other things, as to see also itself? It is that sort of eye which sees all things in itself, and which is likewise in all things. By this sublime method, we could be like that sort of eye, if we could discern our species substance, so that our eye could perceive itself, our mind enfold itself. Then it would be possible to understand all as it would be misprint. Then it would be possible to understand all as it would be simple to do all. However, the nature of things in composition and that possess body does not permit this, for its substance abides in movement and quantity, even if by itself it neither moves nor is moved. From this, for example, we can see that we do not exist in some deep and divided abyss, but that certain things exist as accidents of ourselves according to their external surface, that is, color and shape, and as the very eye's likeness in a mirror. For our intellect cannot see itself and all things in themselves except in an outward appearance, likeness, image, shape, or sign. This, according to the ancients, was first expressed by Aristotle and is understood by few of the neoterics. Our intelligence is either fantasy or not without fantasy. And again, we do not understand except by observing fantasies. Now, this is a bad translation. The original Aristotle says man cannot understand without images. It's from De Anima. But anyway. This means that we do not understand by any simpleness, condition, and unity, but by composition, combination, plurality of terms, by means of discourse and reflection. But if our gift is such, its efforts should doubtless be of the same quality, that specifically by inquiry, discovery, judgment, arrangement, and memory, it and they may not stray beyond the mirror, and not be moved except by images. If a polished and flat mirror were placed here, and if by art the light of the cannons were to grow strong on the horizon immediately after, and because of the special ability conferred on us by things as clear and conspicuous images coming into view, then we are guided towards the highest happiness in the manifold genus of act that is most appropriate of all to a human being insofar as he is a human being. Now, that's Bruno. And Bruno is a pain in the ass in the first place. Even if you're translating, for example, I think Cena della Ceneri, which I think came out of Italian, as opposed to the Latin texts, which are even harder. He's fucking all over the place. He's got, this Baroque style of speaking that's a little bit too much. And then the problem is that you have people who, first off, aren't very good at Latin at all. And then they're having to translate Bruno. And the problem is that you can translate him literally, but to do justice in a translation, you have to actually understand what he's talking about. And it should be clear from what I just covered that he is extremely obscure. And so the vast majority of the people, I thank them for doing the work of translation, but generally they're crappy translations and you have to do what you can with them. Now, I'm just going to give you this last little bit from Bruno, and we will move back on to other understandings of how things are reflected, how things come to life as in a reflection. Yes. And for those who are really interested in this, the more difficult passages of Bruno, I can understand that it's difficult when you hear someone else reading them to you. It would be easier if the text was before you. All I can say is get this book. Didn't cost as much when I got it, but now apparently it's like $500 used if you can find it but you can always go back and look at the transcription here in YouTube if it's any good. If nothing else, you can also, so to speak, rewind. Listen to it on the phonograph. Come on, man. And go back to it again. So here's the last part. This is from Book 1, Part 1, Chapter 1, and it is subtitled On Light, Radius, and Mirror. Being is perceived and distinguished under three headings, universally called metaphysical, physical, and logical, as these are the three principles of everything, God, nature, and art. And three effects proceed from this divine, and three effects proceed from this, divine, natural, and artificial. Every agent should be constituted for a specific purpose, and not out of any such necessity as the appearance of effective matter, so that it has a preconceived aspect. Plainly, this appearance in advance of the world of natural things, I'm going to say this again, plainly, this appearance in advance of the world of natural things is called form or the vestige of ideas. Again, in advance of natural things. Plainly, this appearance in advance of the world of natural things is called form or the vestige being literally shadow, trace, sorry. Form or the vestige of ideas. In the world of post-natural things, it is called reason or intention, and is further distinguished into primary and secondary, which we usually call the shadows of ideas. Sorry, I butchered that paragraph, but there it is. These ideas are the cause of things before the things exist. The vestiges of the idea are the things themselves, or what vestiges are in things. The shadows of the ideas are from the things themselves, or exist after the things, which are said to exist with so much less reason than those things which proceed out of the lap of nature, just as in the same way the things themselves are less than mind, while idea and principle are effective, supernatural, substance-generating, and transphysical. This is going to get better, people. I appreciate you bearing with me. We will. This is the Bruno part. I said I would do the difficult part first. Thus, beings are distinguished into those which are things, and into those things which are their signs or indications. This distinction is just about the same as the one given above, and which the uninformed public proclaims as the division into substance and accident. We are deliberately proposing a method by which by no means concerns things, but which rather treats, We are deliberately proposing a method which by no means concerns things, but which treats, rather, the significance of things. A method in which may be easily ascertained that there exists beyond a doubt a productive power in all things, by those who will contemplate the word and characters of nature in the usual way, who will call calmly to us from all sides and describe the species of things, since matter, less than idea and form, seems to contribute to the specification, I should really say speciesification, of producing all things. For in this principle, all things come together and are one. And truly, in this and through this, all things are distributed into the genus, the species, and their numbers. But from this, it is apparent that generally the same nutriment becomes in a dog, the dog's substance and seed, in a man's substance and seed, and an ape's substance and seed, because the idea which is present in dog, man, and ape, which we discover is not separated from things, but most things joined to themselves. Bad translation. This isn't my fault. It's a bad translation. And there's some pieces that I wanted to get across here that I didn't get as far as this section, which is just so muddled that I would not blame anyone if they cannot understand it. Let me see if I can gloss it, because it's difficult. Here he summarizes. To say it in one word, let everything be considered by application as one, and one, by its formation, as all. Just as by practicing the following method, it will be better and more aptly explained. Therefore, starting once again from the beginning, we say concerning matter and species that, after we have understood supernaturally one infinite being, an intensive whole, discovered everywhere and completely in boundless immensity, in the same way we have placed before all eyes one extensive universe, which is physically visible, sometimes in some parts, and at other times in other parts, and in one place at one time, and in another place at another. Yet on the other hand, the species of substance, which really are in substance, are discovered as accidents. The order of the cosmos is rational, as it is in the likeness of the natural, of which it is the shadow, as it is the image of the divine, of which it is the vestige or trace. Hello. I'm surprised everybody didn't just fucking drop from the stream. The point here, according to Bruno, is that there is an eye that sees, and yet in some esoteric fashion, it is one with that which is seen. And we're going to have to hold that, because, and I intentionally did this because this part is exceedingly difficult, not least because of the translation and because Bruno is who he is. I want you to bear in mind what we were saying about an eye that sees, and somehow in seeing that which it witnesses participates in the isness of that which it sees. You know, if I see that thing, somehow it is in and of me insofar as I witness it. Likewise, I am of it because my assumptions and predispositions have, so to speak, been projected upon it as I think about it and I consider it. And hopefully at least some trace of how this all goes back to the idea of, interpretation and looking at events and getting it wrong, and the business of crazy people who are hypersensitive and people who can go psychotic attempting to organize the phenomena. Hopefully some aspects of this are breaking through how dense the considerations are, because, and how bad I am at explaining it, because, you know, when Bruno talks about the eye that sees, in some respect, participating with that which is seen, think about the way a psychotic person projects their own misunderstandings onto circumstances and then attempts to give order to them. The way in which the person who has the predispositions or issues of any kind, whatever they are, the way that person projects upon everything that he or she witnesses is apparent. I mean, the whole talk of projection and what, so to speak, progressives and the left think you're doing, and really the way in which it's what they're doing. You know, like people who are really guilty of someone who accuse you of lying. You know, I mean, the examples in life are endless. I apologize for how dense this is, but I want to leave a trace for people who are up to digging into Bruno, because there are aspects of this that are very interesting there. But in taking this byway, I did so at the expense of comprehensibility by quoting a fucking 16th century Italian in a bad translation from Latin. So was the game worth the candle? I don't know. The point is that you can look at what he's talking about there as something, you strip a little bit of the metaphysics out of it, and you will see that there is a mysterious identity between the person who sees and what they see, and that projection and identification on a psychological level are a part of it. But if you wish to go further to the mystical, you could almost say that there is a process of subjective ramification of existence as each witnessing eye beholds all that creation has to offer and reflects within himself or herself, or within itself, yet another multiplication of all that is. And we're going to get into this. We're going somewhere with this. Believe me, at the end, this will hopefully go somewhere. And I will take questions, and hopefully, you guys will think of the things that you want to ask me about, and I will attempt to address them. The next one in our little flora legium, having to do with interpretation and sensitivity and intelligence and how it can go wrong, is a poem from Rumi. Now, this is in particular, it's Coleman Barks' translation, which is what it lacks in precision, it makes up for in accessibility. So that's why I wanted to put it after the Bruno, so that people wouldn't feel like, you know, that the night was going to close with the misery of attempting to digest Bruno's ideas as expressed. Okay, this is a poem by Rumi. It is titled here, though I do not think in the original, in Coleman Barks's translation, as Chinese art and Greek art. The prophet said, "There are some who see me by the same light in which I am seeing them." I hope that people will immediately grasp the parallels between all the things that I've just been, or among all the things that I've just been talking about. But anyway, Chinese art and Greek art. The prophet said, "There are some who see me by the same light in which I am seeing them." Our natures are one. Without reference to any strands of lineage, without reference to texts or traditions, we drink the life water together. Here's a story about that hidden mystery. The Chinese and the Greeks were arguing as to who were the better artists. The king said, "We'll settle this matter with a debate." The Chinese began talking, but the Greeks wouldn't say anything. They left. The Chinese suggested then that they each be given a room to work on with their artistry, 2 rooms facing each other and divided by a curtain. The Chinese asked the king for 100 colors, all the variations, and each morning They came to where the dyes were kept. Dyes is an interesting word. You'd think they were painting the wall, but they said dyes here. Couldn't find the original Persian to check it, but I think it is dyes. You know what dye is in Latin? Dye, D-Y-E, in Latin is tincture. But anyway, let's come back. The Chinese suggested then that they each be given a room to work on with their artistry. 2 rooms facing each other and divided by a curtain. The Chinese asked the king for 100 colors, all the variations, and each morning they came to where the dyes were kept and took them all. The Greeks took no colors. They said, they're not a part of our work. They went to their room and began cleaning and polishing the walls. All day, every day, they made those walls as pure and clear as an open sky. There is a way that leads from all colors to colorlessness. Know that the magnificent variety of the clouds and the weather comes from the total simplicity of the sun and moon. The Chinese finished, and they were so happy. They beat the drums in the joy of completion. The king entered their room, astonished by the gorgeous color and detail. The Greeks then pulled the curtain dividing the rooms. The Chinese figures and images shimmeringly reflected on the clear Greek walls. They lived there, even more beautifully, and always changing in the light. The Greek art is the Sufi way, says Rumi. They don't study books of philosophical thought. They make their loving clearer and clearer. No wantings, no anger. In that purity, they receive and reflect the images of every moment from here, from the stars, from the void. They take them in as though they were seeing with the lighted clarity that sees them. Remember what we just covered in Bruno? They take them in as though they were seeing with the lighted clarity that sees them. Now we almost have the materials we need to jump into freeform outside the flora legium. Why does all this matter to me? Because my father was always borderline crazy. His girlfriends would refer to him as being on the spectrum. I mean, only late in life, because this Asperger's crap only started late, you know, in terms of it being a cultural thing where people would talk about it. But they attempted to, his last girlfriend attempted to explain away his behavior and, you know, the rest, his ways of seeing and doing things as Asperger's. He did finally, at the end, addled and, you know, on pain pills that were liberally prescribed to him, finally lose it. But there was an aspect of him attempting to navigate the space that surrounded him and to find points of reference and orientation. He left notes on everything. My father left notes everywhere. Oh my God, man. My brother and I had to go find all of his stuff after he died. Like, there was nothing without notes. I'd open an old Chinese herbal medicine cabinet with its tiny drawers, and I'd find like a tiny little plastic bag. And in one of these hundreds of drawers, you know, the little plastic bag would be there with a little, what looked like a little black rubber band. And it said replacement belt for A-track reel to reel, you know, something that he had never looked at in 20 years. He had been a sailor, so he kept a captain's log when he was on his schooner. And then later in life, he wrote notes about everything at all times. I've got a palette of his papers, just the papers, not the rest. So he attempted to orient himself in time and space through the leaving of these little textual notes. So I've seen how people who are attempting to confront circumstances can deploy systems in order to make sense of what confronts them, and that might otherwise overwhelm them. Now, this is an important thing when we think of, for example, the aesthete, right? The attenuated aesthete who's just too sensitive, you know, don't put the orange light on me or it'll hurt me. But then I've seen it. I mean, haven't any of you ever been there in a situation where the horrible flickering fluorescent light starts up and the green light comes down and it makes you want to puke at the look of everything that surrounds you? Like, nothing causes me to want to just jab knitting needles into my eyes quite like being under fluorescent lights for long periods of time. Again, that sensitivity, and things can become overwhelming and you want ways to get around it. My father was likewise trying to find a way around circumstances to make order by leaving notes everywhere. I mean, he had a record of fucking everything. It was borderline pathological. And then at the very end, it was. But think about your kooks. Think about your kooks that we have to consider, your alien men and your Thomas Victors or your semiagogues, your Oliver Perrins, right? What about those kind of people who are confronted with a weight of phenomena and circumstance, and they attempt to find an explanatory model? Remember when I talked about drug-related psychosis, where when you're attempting to make sense in some paranoid way of what's going on? I remember a friend told me about, I don't know about people in Europe, but in the United States, very often you find that people who are, smoking crack and that kind of thing, or big into meth, you'll find it very much among white people. You'll find it very much among contractors, particularly, painters and carpenters, tradesmen. And many of these people, at least once upon a time back in the day, they'd live at like, Days Inns or like, Super 8 motels, and they'd rent their rooms by the month because they were kind of just hanging on by the skin of their teeth. And these people, one of the horrible stories that I heard once upon a time was about someone who went to visit someone in one of these rooms at a Days Inn, where it was a tradesman who was too deep into the crack rock or the meth or whatever it was. And apparently they went to the window. I've told this story in the past, a long time ago on the channel. Some people may remember it, but they would go up to the window so often to like pull the blinds out and just kind of look out a little bit from the side so as not to be seen looking, that there was literally a greasy smear print on the wall at head height right by the blinds. Like in your house where you're like reaching up to flip the switch too many times in the garage, and because you have grease on your hands or you're working on engines or something, you find out a few weeks later that the whole area around the light switch is all dirty and you have to clean it, right? It was like that, but it was from people's drug-addled heads being placed against the wall looking out the blinds. Or my dad writing notes on everything, or people saying that aliens came down, or people crying with fear and in a terrible situation because their whole universe is breaking down, their means of understanding what's going on is falling apart because the fragile framework they had for understanding has just been shattered. Whether it's someone sitting in the street screaming at the sky after Trump was elected, or I just saw there's one clip that Morgoth sent out with some sort of just obviously not highly intelligent, deeply upset person freaking out and crying and asking for Trump to come and save everyone. People try to cope with their circumstances and they attempt to give order to what they have around them. And they do that through a process of reflection. And there are so many dimensions to this term reflection that you can consider. One of them is the way in which you can say, well, it's reflection in the sense that, like I talked about with the mind and the moon, and the fact that the moon doesn't really have its own light. It just reflects the light of the sun. And then when you start thinking about the eye that sees, that participates somehow in what is seen, there's also this business with reflection in the sense that you're seeing yourself in a mirror, in the sense that the projection is followed by identification. And for example, everybody who knows anything about psychology has dealt with this before. People will project something about themselves that they can't deal with. They'll project it onto you, and then they'll act out whatever their fucking archetypal drama is with you, wearing what they painted you with, as though you're something separate, when in reality, most of the tension and the issues come from the fact that they're confronting some part of themselves that they clearly aren't happy with. Otherwise, they wouldn't be, doing what they do with you. But they don't feel safe enough to do it with themselves. They have to project it outwards. So there's this sensitivity, and there's this aspect, particularly the less and less conscious a person is. I shouldn't say that. This activity exists all the way up the fucking food chain, from the highest IQ or most intelligent people or most sensitive, the most aesthetically tuned, right, all the way down to the most dull and unresponsive, almost like clods of earth, right? All of them have some kind of projection that they get involved in. But what we have is fundamentally about this clip. Remember, this is all about interpretation and how interpretation can go wrong. And metaphysical, if you will, dimensions of that. And now we're going to turn to those. The sun is considered the divine, the source of isness, of life and light and heat, the basis for all that grows, right? Now, once you step out of the pagan world, you know, and you don't have things like, you know, the god of the sun or Sol Invictus or whatever, you nevertheless have the sun metaphorically representing God's light and warmth. There's even a tradition. I remember David Feidler, who published some of my stuff way ages ago with Finance Press. I think he even had a book called Jesus Christ, Son, S-U-N, of God, that tracked the ways in which that metaphor persisted even out of the pagan period into the Christian one. So you have this idea of God, which is reality, which is life and truth and heat, being represented in some respects by the sun. And then you have the idea of the moon, and very often the moon is presented as the soul, as the bridegroom of God. But in the older pagan system, it is the mirror that reflects the divine center. And there are many things that can be thought about with these mirrors. That's why you hear Bruno talking about mirrors. That's why you hear someone far away, though roughly at the same time. Well, was Rumi alive? Wasn't that the 16th century? Let's see, Rumi. Wiki. Oh God, no. Oh my God, I'm embarrassed. 13th century. Shame on me. Oh my God, I'll never live that down. Nevertheless, we see this idea, the metaphor of the moon as mirror, expressed in Bruno talking about light, radius, and mirror, and the mind, mens, as mirror. And we have Rumi talking about it. We have Bruno talking about it. And we have it throughout esoteric lore. I mean, it's everywhere. But there are a number of interesting things that you consider about it. One is active and the other is passive. The sun is generally considered masculine. It's associated with gold, which is considered, you know, the most noble metal, and this sort of thing. And you have silver, which is one step down. It's associated with females. It's associated with the moon. It's, you know, one of the noble metals, but the second. The mirror, the mind, reflects what is in this framework. Part of what I'm going into here is this idea of old psychological models that have existed in the West for quite some time. Much of what I've been talking about could be glossed as Neoplatonic. There's quite a bit of it that goes into Hermeticism. The Rumi stuff definitely gets considered heterodox mysticism. But the idea is that we reflect what we are presented with. However, in the story that we saw with Rumi, the Greek artists polished and polished and polished the walls. The Chinese artists in that story, that teaching story, were concerned with making beautiful things and beautiful colors and doing all the rest. But with the Greeks, so to speak, the quote-unquote Greeks as imagined by a 13th century Persian, or on the border between Anatolia and Persia and what's now Konya, he is talking about something that is reflected. All of them are. But what's interesting is the eye that sees somehow participates in it, and we have the reflection going outwards, the projection, and the rest. So you enter the realm of where the problems start. And where the problems start is when the mirror itself has a distortion. And here there be deep esoteric waters in terms of the metaphors that come into play. And if you take enough time considering them and thinking about them, if the moon is not a perfect what did that schizophrenic call it? If the moon is not a plate which burned bright in the sky, plate very much expressing that it's flat, and flatness being a quality of mirrors that do not have distortions, much like the wall that the Greeks were trying to polish so as to perfectly reflect the artwork that was created on the other side by the Chinese. You have the idea of that which is and then that which reflects it. And we have the idea of mental processes being called speculation, which is Latin for reflecting, like a mirror, speculum. But then you have the idea of, God damn it, the Greek painters and the mirror and the moon. Oh shit, there was a second one and I just lost my train of thought because I wanted to look up and make sure that I had the business with speculum right on mirror. Spiegel in German, right? Speculum. Specular, reflective, like a mirror. That's what bothered me. Speculum is for gynecology or whatever, but it used to be spec, to observe. Yeah, Latin, speculum, reflector, looking glass, mirror. Also a copy, an imitation, right? So the problem arises when something isn't a perfectly flat mirror. The problem arises when Oliver is looking at the circumstances of what's going on with Donald Trump and the rest, and the mirror that reflects those circumstances through which I'm considering things with a heightened degree of sensitivity is not perfectly flat. And it introduces distortions, much like a funhouse mirror. And that's where the problems begin. And that's why I wanted to underscore the thing about the hypersensitivity and the people who are crazy and the people who are autists and those, for example, who are kooks who cling to things too long. There's a whole theme there, and it's the dimensions of it, like I said, from Rumi to Bruno here, you know, running from the 13th century to the 16th. I think Bruno died in, what, 1600? Those themes are clear and persistent, and they go back into the pagan world. And I think it's no accident that going all the way back to me in Proto-Indo-European, as well as men, as well as the example of ratio that I gave you at the outset. You know, and what's interesting about this, I hope this is clear to some people who can follow how badly I'm winding. You know, I would have written you a shorter note, but I didn't have time, you know, and this shit is free. So, you know, your mileage may vary. This is about ontology. I hope everybody sees this. This is about ontology as much as it is about epistemology. And that is where the deepest secrets of this lie, in that it's as much epistemology as it is ontology. Think about this. If God, let us leave aside any sort of orthodoxy. Clearly, I've been drifting far afield from that, right? Let us leave aside any kind of specific doctrine about what that means. Let's just take God with a capital G as what is real and what is all, right? That actually has true existence. Let us hypothesize. Whereas everything else is like an accident. That's why God gets called the creator, right? Everything else has a contingent reality. Well, if we, through the process of speculation or reflection, wish to participate in reality, we can only do so to the extent that, like the Greek artists, we have polished the mirror of our minds perfectly flat and clear, without tincture or distortion. Remember dye? They're talking about the dyes, the colors used by the Chinese artists in the Rumi poem. And in heraldry, tincture gets called the color that's used in the arms and the coats of arms. In alchemy, the tincture is specifically related to, depending on which alchemists you alchemical texts you accept. You know, they're not homogeneous. They're heterogeneous entirely across the board. But depending on which ones you look at, there is the idea that there are tinctures that correspond to the 7 planets. And through a process of washing, you'll often see things like in the Michael Mayer engravings and the stuff from the 17th century, that whole period. You'll often see, like, you know, they'll have a copper plate engraving of a woman cleaning laundry and the rest, and dealing with getting the dirt out of it. There's also the idea of washing it and getting it perfectly clean, which means removing those tinctures. Now, I don't think it's an accident that we also have the idea in Gnosticism of someone who falls from that which is prior to manifestation, carried down by gravity, which is love of the world, into existence, past the sphere, past the fixed stars and the spheres of the planets. And the old Gnostic teaching is that as you pass each planet down on your way to Earth, remember this is Ptolemaic astrology and the Earth is at the center. As you pass each one of those planets, you take on a color or tincture. And each one of those colors or tinctures, reflected, for example, in an astrological chart, correspond to certain domains of life, certain physical problems or advantages, as well as certain social, intellectual, etc., all the domains of human life. So you take upon a tincture from Mars, and if, for example, Mars has a baleful aspect in your horoscope, you know, then you're stuck with that. You might take upon a tincture from Saturn or from Venus and Eros, as was very much the case for me. So as the soul hurtles downwards into manifestation, it takes on tinctures from the planets. Likewise, in some versions of alchemy, you have the idea of ascending back again after a fashion by removing the tinctures or colors. Why does that matter? Well, we're coming back to this idea of ontology and epistemology being one and the same in terms of the consideration that we're looking at here. If there is, think about gels that go on lights in a music hall, right? When I used to work in concert halls, the guys, I'd be there, you know, for security, and I'd see the guys setting up lights before the show, and they're putting the gels on the fronts. This was back when they had gels, when they weren't all digital and everything else. They added a color, they added a tincture, just like adding dye to water and sticking white cotton in it. It's going to take the color. And to whatever extent it takes the color, it is adding something. The tinctures that must be removed add something to what is reflected, making it more red, right? Like putting a red filter on a camera lens, you're going to get red pictures. That's what we have the expression rose-colored glasses. You don't want to have rose-colored glasses. Don't you want to be clear-pilled? You don't want anything getting in the way of what it is you are looking at. So I've covered this from 2 directions. One is the idea of tincture and color, and the idea of washing it and purifying it, clarifying it, that we see with alchemy and Gnosticism. The other one is the idea of, and once again, that's color and light. You remember what we talked about with Des Esseintes and all the colors that surrounded him, the importance of these different ones. On the other hand, we have the idea of reflections and the mirror, and the idea that the mirror must be perfectly polished and flat so as to give a perfect representation of what is there without adding anything to it. Because in truth, to add something to it is to mar it, is to make it, to add something further beyond what is there. Why does that matter? Because as we thought about it, God, as the cause and the principle and the unity of all things, as the font and origin of all things, and as the only true measure of what is real and what is not, everything else has a contingent reality. Remember, epistemology, ontology. What do I mean? Let's leave aside the color example and let's go over to the mirror one because it's more clear here. If God is what is real, and we can participate with that reality ontologically and epistemologically, only insofar as we have a perfect reflection of what is. Think about that. I am a perfect mirror, which means I, so to speak, for purposes of discussion, certainly not the case. But let us say that I have polished my heart and soul and mind perfectly so as to receive the impression of what truly is of God. And I do not add anything to it. I do not take it away. I do not add a tincture, which would have to be washed away. I do not have distortions in the mirror. Like the Greeks, I have polished the wall opposite the Chinese artists so perfectly that it gives this reflection. What did they say in this? Because he particularly touched upon this. What was it? The Chinese finished and they were so happy. They beat the drums in the joy of completion. The king entered their room, astonished by the gorgeous color and detail. The Greeks then pulled the curtain dividing the rooms. The Chinese figures and images shimmeringly reflected on the clear Greek walls. They lived there, even more beautifully, and always changing in the light. Even more beautifully. What if the act of creation was the reflection within individual persons without additional tincture, without distortion in the mirror that changes the shapes to make them bend and distort like horrifying funhouse mirrors? What if that multiplication of all that is was somehow deep within this idea of a pure reflection? And here's the part of it that gets most interesting. The more perfectly you reflect, the less you introduce anything that screws with the truthful representation of what it is that comes across. To whatever extent you distort it, there's not just an epistemological problem, there's an ontological problem, because your being is contingent. To the extent that your soul reflects truly all that is, it participates in isness. And that's where I said it has to do with ontology. But if you introduce a distortion, then you have become a perverted misunderstanding of what is. And because God's grace is boundless and absolutely unlimited, as is God's mercy, then you're in a situation where this is permitted. You are permitted to introduce distortions as you reflect what is. Now, the most perfect approach, so the mystics tell us, is not to introduce anything of your own, to pass on the light colorless and clear, in the case of tinctures, or in the metaphor of mirrors, to polish the glass perfectly so that it will reflect what is. And there's so many dimensions to the metaphor that you can sit and just literally meditate upon, like, what is a mirror? I mean, there's so many ways you can think about it. A mirror is something that has an image in it, but does it have an image in it? It's just light reflected on a surface. The image is absolutely illusory. But there is this mystical idea that somehow, if the mirror has been perfectly polished, flat, and clear, then somehow the image in that mirror comes to life. But it can only do so if you have removed all of the distortions and the rest, which are all that make you unique and individual, which means then you reflect it because you participate in that reality to the extent that you reflect it without distortion. But then the moment it comes alive, well, then it becomes yours. So that is perhaps a metaphysical aspect of this. But we're gonna bring it back around to distortions and projection and all the rest. There's just one last thing I want to touch on, which is the interesting thing about Greek art. Rumi, writing in as I now know, the 13th century, not the fucking 16th. He was talking about these Greek artists. Well, look at the Greek aesthetic. In some ways, when we look at Greek statues and all the rest, we misunderstand what they were. Of course, most of the people who really look into this know that in the past they were painted. But what survives today has had the paint stripped away. And what we see is these pure white representations. And the height of the Western expression is in forms that accurately and truly reflect what is. That's even where we get Western realism. And really, if you go backwards in time without the pigmentation stripped away and the idea of the polished white marble, like if you go back further in time to where they were painted and colored, the standard manifestly by which we measure classical expressions is their truth. Is there truth to form? Is there similitude? Is there likeness? I think it is no accident that Rumi chose the Greeks to represent this aspect of polishing the mirror, colorless and clear, because we of the West have as our focus the idea of an ever more perfect representation. Perfection, I grant you, I'm not going into the realm of blasphemy or a hubris. I realize that that's the infinitely receding horizon. But let us say that we at least take it as a challenge that we wish to rise to, that our representations in multiple senses should be ever more perfect. I mean, think about the moon and the way in which the moon captures and reflects the light of the sun, or the mirror of the soul, which captures and reflects, or I should at least say reflects, the light of God. Again, epistemology and ontology. If there are no distortions, one's understanding reflected in the mirror, ratiocination, mental processes, the mind, moon, mens, mental, epistemology gets tuned up right. But likewise ontology, because our existence is always contingent, and only when we reflect that which truly is without let or hindrance do we actually, for that instant, and only as the merest reflection, only as an accident, do we participate in actual being. And again, if you wish to separate ontology and epistemology, then you can say, well, this is interesting, but I thought we were going to talk about interpretation, Oliver. Well, here's where we jump to the next part, which is what I call the black sun. Now, how long have we been going? An hour and 40 minutes. This is going to be long, folks. Sorry. We'll get to this last piece, and then I will jump over to question and answer. But I do want to talk about the black sun, because this is specifically where it comes together for me, because now we're going to talk about Oliver's imagery. We're going to talk about how I have taken these various things in this little flora legium and this remembering that I have discussed, and how I have my own little mythology for it, my own terms and the rest. But it occurred to me I missed one last one, which is this business of reflecting. Look at photography and the standard of a faithful representation that goes all the way back to the classical world, certainly to the Greeks, and that we see nowhere else. Nowhere else. Nowhere else except in the West. None. Not this standard, this driving standard of faithful representation of the likeness that does not introduce stylistic distortion. Look at what photography is, if not a passive receptivity to light, almost like the surface of the moon taking the light of the sun. And the truer the representation, the fewer the distortions that have been introduced into the reflection, the more accurate the process of capturing an image, whether that be of circumstances or a photograph of one's beloved, right? The more accurate the attempt to throw an imaginative loop into the future and to game out the possibilities or the directions that these very things could go. So this is deep shit. I mean, I don't mean to make too much of it, and I'm certainly not handling it deftly or beautifully. I'd say I'd write you a shorter note, but I didn't have time, except that I've been working on this my whole life, and I'm giving it to you for free. So if you don't like it, well, you can also you can fuck off. Now we turn to this idea of the black sun, what I call the black sun. I used to look at alchemical images, and there is a very interesting thing where they show inversions. There's some where it looks like people are within an athanor and the whole thing has been flipped. And instead of the bottom, well, what was once the top, which is the world of the sun, and you see a little sun at the top, and you see the circular shape, and then you see these waters. And then in the bottom is the moon, but it's been reversed. So if you turn the whole thing over, at the top you have the moon, and you have a little guy sticking up out of the water. And below, in the bottom hemisphere, you have the sun below and a little body sticking up out of the water on that side. It's like there are these two worlds. And it's as though I want to say simultaneous, but I want to say also coincident. How do I say this? At the same time that there is this outward world of things that we experience, there is also an inward world. So let's take the idea, for example, of a, think about the old-fashioned situation with the Victrola, right? Where you actually literally, you had this giant horn and it narrowed down, tapered down to this point. And at the end of it, you had a needle, a stylus, I should say. And you had a platen that was fit to take the vibrational impression of the stylus into its surface. And then once it's taken that impression, you can essentially set the same damn stylus into it and rotate it around, and the same horn that captured the sound in the first place and came down to the point of the stylus that cut the groove, it just operates in reverse. The sound is produced by the vibration of the stylus and moves up through the horn, and you hear it again. This is a way in which, in some fashion, out of mind, deep, mysterious in the extreme, but our soul takes an impression. Aristotle would talk about it in the sense of as the common sense. And this doesn't mean common sense like Thomas Paine or, just, I understand it because I got common sense. This was the sensus communalis. So if I'm not ruining that in Latin, I don't have it in front of me. But the point is that there was a central atrium, so to speak, and Giordano Bruno talks about this too, the atrium of sense. And it is the room into which, at least at a minimum, the five senses that we are aware of open. And in this place of the common sense, a synesthetic impression is formed. And this is just another thing I could, talk for forever about this, but one of the big points that I want to emphasize here is that psychological models or epistemological models and ontological models of the past are highly sophisticated and in many respects vastly superior to the shit that we are supposed to accept from the likes of Freud. I won't go so far as to say Jung, and I won't say that Freud has no value, but these shitbirds who call themselves psychologists, who are just the most risible of the low these days, dismiss all that has come in the past, and they wish to have these scientific models that are and protect me from getting out into the realm of fucking behavioralism and fucking or behaviorism or whatever the fuck it's called, and Skinner and the rest, like the whole pack of these shitbirds at present, with the exception of Jung and some in his circles. They don't even begin to approach the sophistication of the models that we had in the past. So, okay, we're going to set that aside. We'll come back to the sensus communalis. The idea is that all of these senses feed into what is called a common sense, and within that atrium, so to speak, within the soul that receives an impression, an image is formed. And that image is a synesthetic impression. So at the time any memory image is formed, it brings with it some memory of the scent. If it didn't, why, when you smelled the leaves of fall, would it seem to transport you in time more perfectly than anything else ever could to the last fall you can remember? Scent is strange that way. Likewise, textures. Likewise, a particular quality of light. I was talking to my mom recently. She's like, the light hit the water in this way, and it took me back to synesthetic impression. I mean, I don't want to get deep into it, but this book, for example, discusses at length the idea of the intentio, which is this notion that it's not intention, it's an old Latin term, intentio, and it is like the emotional charge of an image. So when something gets impressed within the sensus communalis as a synesthetic impression, not only does it carry all the aspects of the senses, but it also carries an emotional charge corresponding to how you felt about it when the image was formed. Many interesting things. Anyway, the point is that much like we see with the horn that you speak into, that goes down to the stylus and cuts the grooves in the record, we take an impression of all that is. And that impression is taken somehow within the soul, in the mirror within which all of this is reflected. And this is the interesting part. I have to take another little sidestep. We're coming close to the end, ladies and gentlemen. There are two ways. People who don't understand the art of memory or haven't heard me talk about it before, you're going to have to get up to speed. I can't explain it all now. I've already been talking for too damn long. But the point here is there is a thing called the art of memory, and it is about forming images from sense impressions and fixing them in the memory in space in such fashion that they can be navigated, and the space lends order to the sense impressions, and the space lends an organization that makes it easier to recall and to distribute elements within the memory and to organize them in ways, and then to move on from the impressions to what in the old manuals of rhetoric they called invention, because it wasn't just about getting shit into memory, it was invention, the coming down of the breath that inspires inspiration, invention, suspiration, respiration, vent, ventilation, breathing, breath, like the spiritus, right? The idea is with invention that once you assemble these elements within the soul, you can, so to speak, turn away from them, and they live after a fashion. They have a reality within you, and they can do things, so to speak. How shall I say this? One aspect is they talked about the artificial memory, which are the images and impressions that you fix within yourself according to human art. That's not art like I want to go to an art gallery. If you don't know about Aristotelian ars, I can't talk about it right now, but go figure it out on your own. But the point is that you take the impression and it has a life somehow inside of you. There are specifically old art of memory texts that describe how you have to have a fixed distance between the images and elements that you memorize. Otherwise, the images will grow over into each other and confuse your memories. And this really matters because it raises all sorts of questions about the nature of knowledge itself. If these old people, once upon a time, who studied the art of memory would fix through images in their memories these ideas, and if they put the statue that represented one idea too close to the niche that holds a statue for another idea, they recognized that you might come back later in meditation and see that the one idea was tangled in the other, sometimes quite literally. You know, like Tristan and Isolde being buried next to each other, but the ivy growing between them, which suggests that somehow those things which you fix in your memory are alive after a fashion. You don't have to be there once they're fixed in your memory for them to do what they do. Now think about that again in the sense of a mirror that reflects what is true, and a mirror that takes upon itself the reality of creation to the extent that it captures the image of what is real without adding anything further to it. Then we can come back from all of this. If that's not enough, then it won't be for anyone, but those for whom it is enough, as I said before, it'll probably be too much, so forgive me. Now we can turn back to the idea of interpretation. And this is what I call the black sun, this inverted realm where we take an impression of sense in the daylight world lit by the sun. We take impressions from our life experiences. Some of them appear as little snippets in dreams. Some of them get tangled up in other memories and confused and disordered, which is why witness statements are so unreliable quite often. But to whatever extent we have polished the mirror and we take a true impression, or we cast a true reflection, or we reflect accurately, then those things come to life within us. And to whatever extent we have distortions, to whatever extent we have tinctures that have been added, then they distort our process, our ability to be able to weigh and consider those things that we're concerned about and reach accurate predictions or understandings of outcomes. And I cannot emphasize enough the extent to which there is a mystery about these things coming to life within us. There are sense impressions that everybody who's listening, probably people, I've seen the chat going in the background, people are probably just talking about bullshit in the background. And I don't blame them, because a lot of this is obscure and recondite, but everybody who's listening right now has had experiences in their lives where they have had sense impressions during the day, and then they go to sleep and they dream. And they see little bits and pieces, but rearranged strangely, of the things that hit them during the day. And they can be deeply significant. And they can come around, come to consciousness in the morning and think to themselves, wow, it was kind of weird. There was this thing where my friend from work, who I know, he was kind of there, but he wasn't my friend. I mean, he was my friend, but he wasn't my friend. Like, it was all my friends, and my friend's face kept changing. And, and there's an emotional charge to it. Like, you wake up from the dream, you feel like, oh my God, there's something really important there that I needed to understand. There are even dreams, we are told, that predict the future. Do we see these themes of accurate reflection, of elements of sense impression coming into our souls and somehow coming to life? Do we see how our distortions and misunderstandings can twist our ability to predict and understand what is happening? I mean, really, the whole experience of taking in sense impressions, and we'll just go with the Aristotelian bottom-up version for now, right? We don't. There's a whole other side of this discussion that starts with the sort of Platonic top-down, but just for now, let's go with this. Like I said in De Anima, Aristotle said, man cannot understand without images. The images are formed from sense impressions and gathered together in the common sense. If the common sense is not a mirror that has been polished flat, then it can introduce distortions. And so when you take the stage of your mind and you set the little wind-up figures upon it after turning their little keys and setting them down on the stage and considering which way they might go, what might Trump do? What might these other players do? Where will they go? What will happen, right? Or, I mean, we could take it to other directions, which are, personal relationships and the rest, things that are more immediate. If there's a distortion, then the image formed of what will come will be inaccurate. But the prize, the conjunction of epistemology and ontology that is most interesting is the idea of polishing that mirror smooth and flat so that it gives a true representation, a faithful representation of what is there. Because the beautiful thing is, and I will close with this aspect and then we will turn to questions. The beautiful thing is that out here in the real world, I can hold up the pen and drop it. It's gone. Everything that was involved with that pen being in my hand before it hit the ground, it's gone. But in my memory and imagination, it's as though I can scroll backwards and forwards along the clip, right? I can grab the little slider on the bottom and I can go forwards and backwards. I can, in some version of combinatorics, change the arrangement of the pieces on the board and play it forward and backwards again. This is the thing we particularly see when someone is deeply in some sort of emotional relationship with someone else, and they feel that it's falling apart, or and they still care and they want to keep it together, but it's about to fall to pieces. Very often people will sit there and they'll play over and over in their mind. Certainly I did, what could I have done differently? Or what can I do in the future? Imagining that you have power over it. And inevitably, because of emotional charge, in a very, very deep sense, not surface emotional, We take on a color or a tincture, a distortion, a hope or a fear that distorts the surface of the mirror and prevents a clear reflection. And that is something we must guard against. And this business of an attempt to understand what's going on with Trump that I was unsuccessful with, it doesn't really go to the deepest aspects of what most concern me. As I said at the outset of this discussion, that which is called mystic is what interests me the most. But over the last 5 years, I decided to turn my attention to the affairs of men. I guess I got what I deserved, you know. If you want to look at a cat's asshole, you're welcome to, but it's going to look like a cat's asshole. And I guess that's what I saw. Anyway, while most of the considerations that I have shared tonight apply to that more serious dimension of ontology and epistemology, it certainly applies in some more limited sense to considerations of what are going on out there, what's going on out there in the world right now. And so when it is necessary for me to back up from my misapprehensions and attempt to figure out what is going wrong, reviewing, remembering, and doing so in such fashion that we've formed a little flora legium, just very briefly and for illustration purposes. Again, I said I wanted to try to show how something can be thought about in addition to the particular subject of what I happen to be thinking about at this time. You know, we looked at the Book of Memory by Mary Carruthers. We caught an old poem about Greek and Chinese painters in Rumi's selection from his Mathnawi. We hit Huysmans, Arrebourg, and this character of Des Esseintes. And we hit a little bit of Giordano Bruno, which is perhaps the most difficult of all the shit in here because of how it's come down to us and the translations and the rest. But for those who are really into such things and who captured some bit of what I was discussing here, we have a bit more. So that is a review of the metaphysics of interpretation and how that ontology of it and the epistemology of it overlaps. For those of you who have traveled with me this distance, I thank you for your patience. We've come to 2 hours. Normally I stop at an hour at most, but by God, I'm going to get this shit out. I have a poem that I will close with, but in the meantime, I will turn over to this business of questions, and I will attempt to answer them. So, yeah, what do we got here, peoples? Did any of this fucking come across? Is it all insanity? Very likely it is. I have no idea what the hell what I'm talking about sounds like to people on the outside, other than that I too might be considered something of a kook. So yeah, I'll start taking questions now. What do we have here? We have how do I do this? I'm looking over in the one chat. Baggins, New Zealand says, if President Trump was the universe winking at us, what is the Biden administration? Well, it's something that's winking also, except it's not an eye, it's an asshole. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Man, 150 people put up with this. I am shocked. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. What's this? Joel Osteen and Creflo Dollar says, Semigog, do you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? No, I accept the figure of the Christos as one central to my Western heritage and one with many, many deep lessons. And I have nothing against those who do accept Christ as their Lord and Savior. I just take the advice of Christ saying, drop all that shit, leave it all behind and follow me, as being a very literal call to follow his path. And his path was an individual one, because as much as he was a son of God, is a son of God, he is also man, truly, in both at the same time, somehow in some mysterious way. And so I see his call to each of us being one to set these things aside and walk his path individually to the best of our own ability, each of us. And I recognize that is heterodox. I recognize that that is not true Christianity. I have nothing against true Christianity. I'm more about individual, let us say, individuation, and that going beyond merely psychological to the mystical or spirit. I don't even want to say spiritual. Let's say the intensely personal level. All right. Guy from V says, "Semi-God, blood or souls?" I say blood and souls for my Lord Ariak. That being a reference to a fantasy author. Where did that go? I've got two different sections here. PIB Thought Criminal says, "Do you give any weight to the idea of auras and their colors?" I don't know if I call them auras. I think that in the Herkalia, or what's called the Barzakh, or the world of fire, which is intermediate between the eternal world of ideals, which is pure light, and the world of clay and matter, which we occupy. It's an intermediate world. And in that intermediate world, there is a way of seeing. That's what I was talking about with the black sun. I didn't really get into it because I was just going too far, and I already think most people are, I'm explaining things very, very badly, and most people are probably not interested, but there does come a point at which one can superimpose intentionally, or have superimposed through an unconscious process, which can be quite alarming, the internal imagery of the reflection upon all the matter and experience out here in front of us. It often gets called hallucination, and that is the true black sun. That is where what I see in my mind's eye through the sensus communalis is superimposed on what is out here before us. And to the extent that my mirror reflects things truly, and only to that extent, and distorted to whatever extent it does not do so, I can superimpose all on that which I witness, superimpose upon that which I witness all of that which exists within me that's played out in the mirror. And that can be a very strange thing to see, because it participates in what alarms psychopaths and schizophrenics and the rest. They are not conscious of the fact that their internal content, so to speak, is painting that which is out there before them in manifestation. But if you are conscious of it, there is a way in which what gets called auras and many other things, like saints coming to talk to you, or hearing voices, a million of these phenomena. But they're conscious. If you're conscious of where they come from, whether you characterize it as God or a reflection of isness or whatever, it can superimpose itself on all that is out there, and it looks very, very different indeed. That's different than Kirlian photography or imagining that you can see an aura or whatever. There's a point I had to come to, at least for myself. God damn, I'm out of apple juice. And at that point, I realized that I can paint everything I see. I remember once that I went out one day and I was in a really good mood, and I went to this huge indoor shopping area. They had about all kinds of fish markets, and it was a giant farmer's market, and they had all kinds of food. I remember being in this great mood, and I came back and I was talking to Tim about it. I was like, yeah, man, it was a great day out. And he's like, well, you know, you painted the world that way, you know, so don't think of it strictly as being that that was a good day. What did you bring to it? You know, likewise, when I'd be pissed off about something, what do you bring to it? There's a point I realized that we can paint these things around us, and the extent to which we can do so. Oh my God. Oh my God. Half of the body dysmorphia shit, where people look at themselves and think they're fat, or think that they need to have bigger muscles, or they have to continue their little bulimic process of wearing the fucking enamel off of their teeth, or they think that they have to continue anorexically starving themselves. Half of that dysmorphia shit we talk about comes down precisely to this mechanism of painting what we see with our own internal content. But remember when I talked about the collective unconscious on the one hand, which is as far as the most free thinking of the psychologists, most of them want to go. I mean, Jung, with the publication of the Red Book, some other things, it seems clear that he was willing to go a good bit further. But prior to that, in terms of what he published in his lifetime, he didn't want to go all there. And, you know, and there are other people like Asagioli, but the point is there's quite a bit out there that comes down to this process of projection that I'm talking about. And it can even come down many times because I was born under the baleful, and let me emphasize the baleful sign of Venus. And so I know all about that bitch's fucking shit. I've suffered it and enjoyed its pleasures. And it's just, there comes a time, as I started to say, and I've seen it many times myself, when you shift, or the person you are with shifts from that point at which they see you as being lovely, or you see them as being lovely, to the point at which they somehow no longer are. And if someone is particularly sensitive, perhaps even dangerously oversensitive, then you can almost see those things happening. I remember distinctly once being in this discussion with a woman, and it was falling apart, and I desperately didn't want it to, and it was. And I wrote it in a poem. I wrote it as the moment that you can see that she changed the locks on her eyes. Because you can literally see it. You're looking into eyes that used to open and dilate with spider velvet darkness and welcome all things in with utter receptivity, because every gift of the light that reflected off of you into their pupils was something they welcomed. And then there comes a time when they change the locks on their eyes, and you are fucking out of luck. Likewise, because I don't want to pretend that I was always on the receiving end, likewise, there is a time when you think to yourself, oh my God, man, this person was so beautiful, and I was so attached, and all these unconscious things, and now you look at them and you're like, I did what? I was with whom? Why? I mean, oh my God, am I a different person? Are they a different person? There's total disorientation generally when a person is less conscious about it. And I guess that's a good way to cap this. In the past, last week or two, I've been talking about, I might be wrong about this business with Trump. And, generally I trust my instincts. The only place where my instincts are wrong are, when it comes to relationships with women, because that's the domain of Eros. And that's something to think about. There is a clip I did in the past on Amor Ereos, which is all about erotic projection and identification. And if anyone is fucking mad enough to care about any of these things that I've just undertaken to describe, I would look at this clip together with that earlier one on Amor Ereos. All right, let me see if there are other questions here. Do I give any weight to the idea of auras and their colors? Yes. Kel is saying that's why the OTO use women to torture the children to death. The OTO? Torturing children to death? Maybe that's a different branch of the OTO than I know about, because they're mostly just ridiculous. Okay. More from SD without death. All right. Questions. Do we have any questions? You must address them to me, people, or I will become lost in this mess. If they don't come in and I've just bored the shit out of people, then I will shut this down at the 2 hour and 30 minute mark. Let me see what we have here. Questions, put a semiagog at the beginning of it and hopefully ask something related to what I covered here this evening, because I don't want to get off into total la land. You know, just in terms of people who come and watch this later, I'd like it to be something where the questions conform to the subject at hand. So this is it, peoples. Kel mentions Ordinus Templis Orientis. The OTO is Ordo Templi Orientis. All right, this from Stephen Campbell. Semiagog, would you say the best way to interpret this is in a literal mystical way, a figurative way, or a synthesis? Interpret what? You mean the entire subject of my discussion? You ask, is the best way to interpret this in a literal mystical way, a figurative way, or a synthesis? The answer is yes. Baggins New Zealand says, have you ever done shrooms? There are no indiscreet questions, only indiscreet answers. Jesse J says, Semiagog, does the rug on your wall have any symbolic representation to you? It looks like black suns. No, this is a Tajik Suzani. Basically, the women get together and embroider these. You can see the black bands. Those are the vines with thorns. And though they don't show it well, the things in the center that look purplish are roses. So it's basically roses. It's a garden of roses. And every rose has its thorn. Sorry. Ugh, I fucking hate that band. All right, Wandering the Ruins says, I enjoyed this. Have a good night, man, in chat. Thank you very much. Mikhail Williams says, thoughts on paper money? I'm not going there. I want to try to keep it tied to the subject that I covered, as I mentioned. Tyler Bledsoe says, Semiagog, what should a person do if they wish to know their astrological signs? There is a website called AstroDienst. And that is run out of Switzerland, I believe. And if you click through to the right submenu, they will give you a free natal chart. All you have to do is know where you were born, down to the city or town, and the time you were born. The more precise, the better, certainly within a 15-minute block. The issue, however, is that once you get it, once you get that chart, you have to know how to read and interpret it, and that takes a little bit of doing. Minoan says, Semiagog, is most psychosis just oversensitivity? No, I do not believe that that is safe to say. But one of the paths to psychosis and any number of other problems that can be described with more specificity is oversensitivity. And high intelligence, I think, can most easily be described as sensitivity in a particular area, or across a broad band in some cases, though in most that I've seen, there are areas of limitation. You know, even the most Renaissance man kind of guy is going to have some areas where it just kind of doesn't work because the interest and the draw isn't there. But I would not say that psychosis is just oversensitivity. You know, no, there are many other things going on with it, and psychosis itself I see less as a state than as a process of reforming one's self with a small s in moments of crisis, or in moments where one's framework of understanding has become dislocated from the world to such an extent that one doubts what one sees, doubts oneself, doubts one's ability to make determinations. And this brings on a kind of reforming of the self through a psychological process that, if you're interested in it, you can get an introduction about. At least the part of it that I understand and endorse as accurate is a book by John Weir Perry, Perry, called The Far Side of Madness. Justin Lee says, "Are you OTO?" No, but I read a lot of Crowley when I was a little kid, and I went to when I was 16 in high school. I went to one Gnostic mass that was held by a regional branch of the OTO, and I was just like, meh. By the time I was 17 or 18, I was well over Crowley. Knobsmacker says, "Semigog is the inevitability of projection, something to lament." No, I think it's God's mercy and God's grace, and that which is that I call God, which doesn't have a contingent reality upon which all other things depend, gives of itself and in its amplitude and fullness, which is infinite, surfaces upon which we can project whatever the hell we like with every kind of misunderstanding that is necessary to us until eventually we come to knowledge. So no, it's just how it works. And he says, what if these images we conjure come to life on the same plane as we are on? I think it's important. There are a lot of things that I could say that would sound dismissive about that, and that would not be fair, because there's, how do I say this? The imaginal realm, if anybody's interested in this kind of crap, you can also go and look up Henri Corbin, Corbin. He's a French writer, but a lot of it's in translation, and he talks about these other realms, like the imaginal realm, which I don't have time to go into here, but one of the points that he raises is that this more imprecise and changing realm that we call the realm of fire, which is in between the world of clay and the world of light, so to speak, it has ontological priority. It is less fixed. It is less susceptible to empirical measurement. But for that reason, it's more real. However, it's not here. There's a lot I could go into with that, but based on your question, I'm going to guess that the best way to answer this is that the images that you conjure are in and of yourself. Would you hurt yourself? I know I wouldn't. Very early on in my experience, it was suggested to me that I needed to just chill out and let the things pass by on the stage of the mind so as to gain from them whatever understanding is possible. If you're the kind of person who would ask whether or not these images could come to life on the same plane, then what's most important is that you understand that you are central to this process to whatever extent you exist. I mean, we all derive our any reality we have as contingent upon that which truly is. But don't worry about it. Usually, no. There are apparently some species of sorcery you can, hear described. If you go and read, what was that woman's name? Damn it, man. She's the one in Magic, and Alexandra David Neal or whatever. You can read stories in Tibet about how they have manifestations of images, and so it is said it can be done. But in the vast, 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 vast majority of cases, all you're going to be dealing with is your own internal world that has superimposed itself on your sense impressions of that which, physically is. So yes, it is said that such things can be, but in my experience, there's nothing to worry about there, and only, you can read and maybe what's his name, Evans Wentz, about particular Tibetan sorcerers who can manifest a lover out of their own substance, and then one of the tests that they have to pass is to somehow reincorporate it within themselves. But for the most part, that kind of lore aside, no, most of it is what is it, the line from Hamlet about thinking that makes it so? We paint our surroundings with these images, and with calmness and recognition of the fact that these pictures come from within us, and if they don't, they come from God. Then what cause, or if you're, if you recognize multiple gods, then from the gods, what have you to fear? Most particularly from yourself, and the only organ of perception that you have for any of these things is you yourself. And we're talking about a correlation between epistemology and ontology that has yourself sort of as its font and origin. Anyway, I'm talking too much. I hope that helped. And if it didn't, sorry that I couldn't be less sprawling in my attempt to explain. Noah Solomon says, here's a question. What do you think about Aquinas' argument for the existence of God from motion? I am embarrassed to say that I don't know it. All I have for Aquinas' stuff is a 2-volume compilation, and I haven't even read all of it. I've probably used it like 3 times in my life when something got referenced, and I went to see if I could go pull, one of his syllogisms or something. So I'm sorry to say my ignorance precludes an answer, and I wish it didn't. But now I'll go and look. Rick Farwell says, Semigog, have you read any of Evola's works? I've got one of his on the metaphysics of sex, I think it is, and I still haven't finished it. Noah Solomon, who was just asking me, he recommended to me sometime back, what's his name on Gnosticism and the rest? God damn it, I can't even remember now. I shouldn't have had that much apple juice. But yeah, I've got books that were recommended to me as of 2 or 3 years ago that I still have not properly read, and I need to. So yeah, Evola's and I will be reading Ride the Tiger fairly soon, since AA has been throwing that around as something people should check out. PIB Thought Criminal says, Semigog, thoughts on the idea that the brain contains an eye that actually does detect light and images. Those without eyes blind have been shown to see with it. Well, these are just eye stalks. These are actually stalks sticking out of the brain. So when you say, what are your thoughts on the idea that the brain contains an eye? It's got 2 of them, and they stick out in these sockets right here. And why do they need these giant optic nerves, and why do they need to be so close to the brain? Because we're so visual that the most important speed of sense impressions for us is visual. So generally, a sense impression that comes through the eye, the delay between, right now, everything that we exist in exists at a delay of however, whatever fraction of a second it is that it takes for the light to hit the eye, the nerves to pick it up, and to transmit it on these big fat stalks that are designed to make it as fast as possible into the brain. But it's something to meditate upon, this idea that we exist right now at a point whatever fraction of offset from what's actually going on based on the delay of the fastest of the sense impression mechanisms that we have. That's a thing to meditate upon at length, this idea that we're literally separated in time from everything that we think we're experiencing. I mean, that's another one to chew on. I don't know about the idea of some other aspect of the mind that can be receptive to light, because when you talk about detecting light in images, yeah, I don't know. I think there's a strong argument for saying that our ability to assemble this information to some extent is dependent upon physical manifestation and having a brain. If it wasn't, you wouldn't see people get fucked up by strokes. If it wasn't, you wouldn't see problems with brain injuries that directly limit people's ability to think things or see things or understand things that previously they had no trouble with. From the other direction, there is the argument that there is something more eternal that doesn't require this equipment. So yeah, there are a few ways that you can come at that. One is that you can see the light of this other world with eyes that are of that world and that don't even have to be in some part of the brain, right? The other thing is, you know, you can go hit somebody over the head with a 28-ounce framing hammer and be like, what do you see now, motherfucker? Anything? And the answer will probably be no, because the dude will be dead. Not recommending that. That's a colorful metaphor. Yeah, Temple of Set is just fucking stupid. Hard to Watch says, Semigog, favorite whiskey or scotch? There's some scotch that I enjoy, but I've just come around to this idea that, that I'm from the South, and so I should drink bourbon. And so I do. Basic says, Semigog relations with black suns and swastikas around the world like Slavic and Asian. I haven't looked into it. I mean, you know, anybody who looks at iconography and symbol sets and the rest will see the various versions of swastikas that appear around the world. And so, yeah, I've seen that, but it's never been a major interest of mine. And, you know, black suns, I'm talking about something that's different. When I talk about a black sun, I'm talking specifically about the inversion, the negative mirror image within us of the actual source of light that exists out there in the world, in heavily metaphorical senses, mostly. And so I'm not talking about like what you're going to see on the floor of Welsberg Castle or whatever the hell it's called. So, yeah. All right. I like how a guy from V says Ollie and I are Year of the Boars, because the other way of describing that is Year of the Pig. I'll take boar. I'll take boar. I like that. That works better. All right. I think we have... we're coming up on the end here, I think, people. We have Aesthete says, what about Aquino's eyebrows though? Man, that dude is such a fuck him. And fuck LaVey. Fuck all these theater idiots. Fuck all of them. And frankly, there's not much. I have no patience for the damn OTO either. Like, as Tim put it once to me, you know, I was like, did Crowley not, I was 19, I was like, did Crowley not possess some keys to secret knowledge? And he's like, yeah, and he locked himself out with them. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the OTO either, but at least, you know, Crowley understood something, whereas Aquino and LaVey are just fucking Los Angeles scum. Even if they're not from Los Angeles, they went to Los Angeles, tried to, they're just fucking gross. So, yeah. Did somebody just get missed? Hang on. Sorry, somebody was talking about how they got missed, and I tried to look up further and see if they had Noah Solomon. Did you take communion at that Gnostic Mass? You know, I can't remember. I just remember being like 16 or 17 and being like, is that chick on the fucking filmy, gauzy veil? Is she really fucking naked? I was like, I'm glad I took the bus down here after school. Yeah, I can't remember. I mean, maybe. I don't remember. I remember I stood at the back of the room. It was all kind of tawdry to me. It just looked all chintzy and fake. All right. Well, yeah, this will be the second to last question. I'll take one more after this. This is from Quandre Washington the Fourth. He says, Semigog, yo, what's the future for America after Trump gone, yo? And I have to say, I don't know, brother. Thoughts on the Necronomicon? Oh, please, man. No thoughts. I mean, other than it deserves its place in fiction. Any attempt to drag it out of fiction is sort of ridiculous. All right. Is that it? Do we have anything else? No, now we're moving into Trump administration questions and all the rest. Okay, people, we have gotten to 2 hours and 35 minutes. This has been a long stream. I appreciate everybody who hung in there. Hopefully I did not bore the hell out of everyone. I realize it was a little bit recondite and odd. I do not think that this particular clip is going to end up forming the or gaining the largest number of views for the month or anything. All right, I'm going to close with this damn poem because it in its own way relates to all this other shit, and then I will be out. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me. Thanks for bearing with me because I realized I was all over the fucking place. My titties was hanging out. However, I will try to keep it tight with this closing. Thank you all again. And this poem is it. Here we go. And then I will say goodnight. Luna Karkar. It was dream speak. Those two words stood naked before me just before I broke the seal on my eyes. A gnomic utterance wrung from the guts of another restless night. Fools alone imagine what we hear, shared in dreams, can ever be snared with words. The whispering death flutters of unnameable moths commence the instant we pin them into place. Thus, she slips the knot of memory. Does the moon mark the threshold of the prison of flesh? A penitentiary? Mother, mutter, mater, tara, terra, terrestrial, maternal, matter, material. Perhaps another wandering star sharpens its knives while thinking of me. The cracked tablets of lunatic lore record the trials of a body gone dry in Saturn's sly and bitter shadow, desire swallowing the death rattle at its tail end, the resentful silence of cotton-mouth black bile, the thirst for forgetfulness, sucking life's moisture from tired red eyes, the blind urge to decisively smash clocks, and in my case, ashtrays filled to overflowing, as I stalk on tiptoe through the creaking house in the bleary doubling before dawn, marking mad moments of plummeting uncertainty, as though my cross-eyed daemon flipped a cold switch and doubled the gravity for an anxious instant. Moon, mensis, mens, mind, memne, mnemosine, mantis, memory, mania. It must be she. I heard her name. She was talking to me. Or was she me talking? I suspect it's the space between the words that matters. It's always that way in dreams. I see now. Let me therefore clear her name. Lady of the light, only those in darkness require. You lengthen the hours of the morgue, in the morgue stillness of cold winter nights. The other planets bear blazons of color, but you're as white as a winding sheet. A malicious headmistress in a silent and empty classroom, but only beneath the peaked roofs of man that dot the forest like dunce caps, only in the foursquare labyrinth of reasons. There you wane, measuring nothing but our emptiness. Your dwindling light discovers the prison each of us crafts in all its darkness. I was given 2 words, with a world of emptiness between. Luna, Carker. You simply told me never to confuse the light that reveals for the prison itself. Outside ourselves, you are the pregnant silver circle that crowns each month, the truth-sayer of time and tide, riddled with eternity, always hovering untouched beyond our sad little electric fires. Mistress of the hunter and of harrowing and harvest alike, high in the darkness, you draw forth the dew and stir the great swells of the world mirror, filled with witless fish.